I'd worn that ring on my finger for nearly 40 years before I noticed the engraving inside. 40 years. That's longer than some people live entire lives. And I'd looked at that ring, really looked at it, more times than I could ever count. When I washed the dishes and the soap would collect around the setting, when I was nervous and I'd twist it round and round without even realizing I was doing it, when I sat in church and the light through the stained glass would catch the small diamond and throw little colored shapes across the hymnal in my lap, I knew every curve of that ring, every scratch it collected over the years, the tiny dent on the left side of the band where I'd knocked it against the car door frame sometime in the early 90s. I knew it the way you know your own hand. But that afternoon, a Tuesday in late October, the year I turned 78, the sunlight came through the kitchen window at a particular angle. One of those low, golden autumn angles that only happens a few weeks out of the year. And I was sitting at the table with my second cup of coffee, and I happened to hold up my hand to look at something out the window, and the light caught the inside of the band. And I saw something I had never noticed before. I'm going to tell you what it was in a moment, but first I want you to understand that what followed wasn't some dramatic unraveling. It was something quieter than that. It was the kind of thing that changes you slowly, the way seasons change. You don't notice the leaves turning on any single day. You just look up one morning and the whole world is different. Now, if you've watched some of my other stories, you already know that I've been sitting in this chair sharing memories for a little while now. And you know that I don't believe in dressing things up to make them more interesting than they are. Life is already interesting. It doesn't need the decoration. So, if you enjoy listening to an old woman who's had 85 years to think things through, who's loved and lost and made her share of mistakes and had a few things turn out better than she deserved, then you might want to stay a while. Get yourself something warm to drink. I'll be right here. Let me start at the beginning, or close to it. I met Harold in the spring of 1959. I was 21 years old, and I was working behind the counter at Garfield's Pharmacy on Elm Street in the small Ohio town where I grew up. Filling prescriptions wasn't my job. I wasn't trained for that. But I ran the soda fountain in the front of the store, and I kept the display cases neat, and I answered the telephone when Dr. Garfield was in the back. Harold came in on a Wednesday afternoon in April. I remember it was April because the forsythia was blooming outside the window, that impossible yellow, and I'd been watching it all morning while the store was slow. He didn't come in for anything romantic. He came in because he had a headache and he wanted aspirin, and instead of just picking it up off the shelf, he asked me where it was, even though it was clearly labeled right there in front of him. I found out later he'd seen me through the window. He told me that years afterward, a little sheepish about it. He was 26. He had dark hair that he kept neat, parted on the side, and he wore a jacket even though it was warm enough that he didn't need to. He was a serious-looking man in some ways, but when he smiled, and he smiled not long after he asked me about the aspirin, it changed his whole face. It went from serious to something else entirely, something open. We talked for maybe 10 minutes that first afternoon. He paid for his aspirin and he left, and I thought, well, that was a pleasant few minutes, and I went back to watching the forsythia. He came back the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. By the fourth Wednesday, Dr. Garfield teased me about it in a kind way, said it seemed like we had a loyal new customer, and I pretended not to know what he meant. Harold asked me to dinner in June. We went to a restaurant called the Maple Room that doesn't exist anymore. I drove past that corner a few years ago, and it's a cell phone store now, which feels like the saddest possible thing a restaurant can become. We had roast chicken and green beans and a shared slice of pie, and we talked for so long that the waitress had to come back twice to refill our water without us asking. He told me he worked at his uncle's hardware business. He told me he'd grown up in a town 20 miles east of mine. He told me he'd done his military service and come back feeling like he needed to put down roots somewhere, build something. He told me he liked baseball and long drives and that he wasn't much of a dancer, but he was willing to try. I told him about my family, my mother and my father, who was a postman, my younger sister Carolyn, the fact that I'd wanted to go to college, but the money hadn't been there for it, and I was still figuring out what that meant for my life. He listened carefully. He asked questions that showed he'd been paying attention. When a man actually listens, not just waits for you to stop talking, but genuinely listens, you notice it, especially when you're young. We were married 2 years later, in June of 1961. I was 23 years old, he was 28. The proposal happened in February of that year, on a Saturday evening. We'd been to a friend's birthday gathering. Nothing formal, just a group of people at someone's house, eating and playing cards. Harold was quiet on the drive home, in a way that wasn't his usual quiet. He had a quiet he used when he was thinking, and a quiet he used when something was on his mind. This was the second kind. We pulled up in front of my parents' house, and he turned off the engine, and he just sat there for a moment. I asked him if everything was all right. He said, "Elizabeth, I've been carrying something in my pocket for 3 weeks and I keep losing my nerve." He bought the ring at Hennessy's Jewelers, which was a small shop on Market Street run by an older man named Clarence Hennessy and his son, who everyone called Young Clarence, even though he was probably 50 years old by then. It was the kind of place that had been in town before most people could remember. The ring was simple, that's the honest word for it. A thin gold band with a small round diamond set in a 4-prong setting. Nothing elaborate. Harold wasn't a man of elaborate gestures, and I wouldn't have wanted one. It was delicate and clean, and it caught the light beautifully. He put it on my finger there in the car, with the heater ticking and the windows fogging slightly from the cold outside, and he said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life with you if you'll have me." Not the most poetic proposal you've ever heard, perhaps, but it was Harold, and I said yes before he'd quite finished the sentence. I ran inside and woke my mother up, which she later said she forgave me for. I held my hand out under the kitchen light, and she said it was beautiful. My father came downstairs in his robe, squinting, and when we told him, he shook Harold's hand for a long time without saying anything. That was enough. I showed that ring to everyone I knew over the next few weeks. I'm not ashamed to admit it. My sister Carolyn held my hand up to the window and turned it this way and that. The women at church gathered around and made the warm sounds that women make when one of their own gets engaged. My friend Dorothy, my dearest friend from childhood, said it suited me perfectly, and Dorothy was not a woman who gave compliments loosely, so that meant something. I wore that ring to our wedding in June. I wore it to the hospital when our daughter Patricia was born in 1963, and again when our son Robert came along in 1966. I wore it through the years when Harold's uncle's hardware business struggled, and we had to be careful about money in a way that left you tired. I wore it when things got better. I wore it when we moved to a bigger house and then to a smaller one after the children were grown. I wore it the day Harold retired and we took a trip to the Smoky Mountains that we'd been promising ourselves for 20 years. I wore it when Patricia got married and Robert got married. I wore it to my mother's funeral and my father's funeral and my sister Carolyn's funeral, which was the hardest one because Carolyn was younger than me, and it's a particular kind of wrong when the younger one goes first. 40 years of ordinary life, that ring was on my hand. 40 years of mornings and arguments and reconciliations and Sunday dinners and car trips and illnesses and recoveries and all the thousand small moments that don't get remembered individually but somehow add up to everything. Then, one October morning, the light came through the window at the right angle, and I saw something inside the band. I took the ring off, which I almost never did. My hands had changed enough over the decades that it wasn't easy to slide off. I had to work it past my knuckle, but I got it off, and I held it up to the light, and I tipped it so I could see inside the band. There was an engraving there. The inside of the band had been engraved, and the letters, small and slightly worn but still legible, read, "For M, always, R." I sat with that for a long moment. My name is Elizabeth. My husband's name was Harold. Not an M, not an R anywhere in either of our names. I turned the ring around in my fingers, looked at it again. The letters were definitely there. I couldn't believe I'd never noticed them, though when I thought about it more carefully, I realized I'd never really had an occasion to look inside the band with any kind of attention. You don't, do you? The inside of a ring isn't something you
examine. You put it on and you leave it there. For M, always, R. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I think it's important. I didn't feel betrayal, not exactly. What I felt was more like vertigo, a slight tilting of something I thought was perfectly level. The way the ground feels different for a moment after an earthquake, even when nothing is visibly broken. Harold had been gone for 4 years by then. He passed in 2003, a February morning, quietly, the way he'd lived. And so I couldn't simply walk into the next room and ask him about it. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, turning the ring in my fingers, and I thought about who M might be, and who R might be, and why a ring with those initials had ended up on my finger for 40 years without my knowing. I called our daughter Patricia that afternoon, not because I was distraught. I want to be clear about that, but because Patricia has always been the organized one, the one who keeps records and remembers details, and I thought perhaps she might know something I didn't. She didn't know anything about an engraving. She was quiet for a moment when I told her, and then she said, "Mom, did you ever ask Dad where exactly he got the ring?" I told her what I knew, Hennessy's Jewelers on Market Street. She said, "Young Clarence's son took over that shop, didn't he, Thomas? He might still be there." Thomas Hennessy was indeed still there. 3rd generation. The shop had moved a few blocks from the original location, but it was still called Hennessy's, and Thomas had been running it for years. Patricia looked up the number and called me back with it. I want to pause here and say something. I debated with myself for a few days before I called Thomas Hennessy. Part of me wondered whether this was something I needed to know. Harold was gone. Our marriage was what it was. Good, long, real. Whatever this engraving meant, it was from before my time, and perhaps some things are better left as they are. But I've never been very good at leaving things unexamined. It's a quality that served me well sometimes and got me into trouble other times. So after 3 days of turning that ring in my hands each evening, I called Hennessy's Jewelers. Thomas Hennessy was a pleasant man. He remembered Harold, which surprised me at first, but then he explained that Harold had been a regular customer over the years. He'd come in to have the ring cleaned, to have the prongs checked, once to have the band slightly resized when my fingers changed after Patricia was born. A customer like that, you remember. I asked him about the engraving. There was a pause on the line, not a guilty pause, more like a careful one, the pause of a man deciding how much of something belongs to him to tell. He said, "Mrs. Marsh, I think that might be something my father knew more about than I do, but I can tell you what I know." What he knew was this. The ring had originally been sold by his grandfather, the elder Clarence Hennessy, sometime in the early 1950s. Thomas had found the original sales receipt years ago when he was going through old business records, because Hennessy's had kept meticulous records going back to their founding, which was a point of pride. The receipt showed the ring sold, custom engraved, to a man with the last name beginning with R. Thomas couldn't remember the full name from memory. The records weren't things he kept at hand, but he remembered the initial because he'd looked at that receipt once years back when Harold had brought the ring in for cleaning and asked Thomas's father something about it. Thomas had been a young man then, just starting to learn the business, and he'd overheard part of the conversation without fully understanding it. He said Harold had asked his father whether the engraving could be removed, and his father had said it could, but it would weaken the band, and at Harold's request they'd left it. Harold had known the engraving was there all along, and he'd chosen to leave it. I thought about that for a long time. I'm going to tell you what I eventually learned, or rather what I eventually pieced together. But first, I want to say something about what it means to be married to someone for 40 years and discover there are things you simply didn't know. People assume that long marriages mean complete knowledge of another person, that after enough decades you've learned everything there is to learn. But that's not how people work. We don't reveal ourselves all at once. We're not documents to be read through once and fully understood. We're more like old houses. You can live in a house for decades, and then one day you're doing something ordinary, and you open a door you'd always assumed was a closet, and there's a whole room behind it that you never knew existed. That room doesn't mean you didn't know the house. It just means the house had more to it than you'd mapped.
What I learned through a combination of what Thomas Hennessy told me and what I eventually found in a small bundle of letters that had been in the bottom of Harold's desk drawer, which I hadn't gone through after he died because I'd meant to and then hadn't been able to, was this. Before Harold met me, when he was in his early 20s, just back from his military service and still finding his footing, he had been engaged to a woman named Margaret.
Margaret was from his hometown, the town 20 miles east of mine. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, gone to the same church, been sweet on each other since they were teenagers in that way that sometimes happens in small towns where two people seem to belong together simply because they've always been around each other. He bought her a ring. A simple ring, a thin gold band with a small diamond. He'd had it engraved for M, always, R. R for Robert, which was Harold's middle name, though no one ever called him that. He was always Harold to everyone who knew him. But apparently Margaret had called him Robert sometimes, or perhaps it was simply that Robert was more romantic than Harold, which I say with great affection for my husband's name. They were engaged for about a year, and then Margaret became ill. It wasn't cancer, not what we'd call cancer now at least, though I'm not entirely sure of the medical details from that era. What I understood from the letters was that she had something wrong with her lungs, and that over the course of about 8 months she declined, and that Harold stayed with her through all of it, visiting every week, even when the visits were difficult. Margaret died in the winter of 1952. She was 24 years old. The ring came back to Harold, as these things do. Margaret's mother had sent it to him in a small envelope with a note that said simply that Margaret would have wanted him to have it. He kept it. He didn't sell it. He didn't throw it away. He kept it in a small wooden box in the back of his desk drawer for 6 years, and then he met me at the pharmacy counter on a Wednesday in April, watching the forsythia through the window. And when he decided to propose, he went to Hennessy's, maybe because he'd bought it there originally, I'm not sure, and he asked about having it reset, made to look a little different. Young Clarence's father had reset the prong setting slightly, polished the band, made it look as close to new as it could with look. Harold had asked about removing the engraving and been told it was possible but inadvisable, and so he'd left it there, inside the band where no one would look, where M and R would stay, quiet and private, underneath the surface of our life together. He never told me. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I had to. Because your first instinct, perhaps, is to feel something on my behalf, to feel that I was wronged somehow, or deceived, and I understand that instinct. I had a version of it myself, sitting at that kitchen table with the ring in my hand and the October light fading around me. But here is what I came to understand, slowly, the way I said at the beginning, the way leaves change. Harold was 28 years old when he proposed to me. He was a man who had loved someone genuinely and lost her in the most irreversible way possible. He'd spent 6 years carrying that, not loudly. Harold never did anything loudly, but carrying it the way quiet people carry things, which is to say, completely and without putting it down. And then he met me, and he decided he wanted to build a life with me, and he chose to put on the table the best he had, which was himself, and his seriousness, and his smile that changed his whole face, and his capacity to listen. And he chose, perhaps, not to lead with the grief, not to present the ring with an explanation that might have shadowed everything that came after. Was that the right choice? I've turned that question over many times. I think, and I say this as someone who knew Harold for 42 years, I think he kept it quiet, not out of dishonesty, but out of a kind of protection. protection of what we were building, and perhaps in some way protection of Margaret too, keeping her in a place that was private and his own, not something to be discussed or explained or worked through in conversation with his new wife. I won't pretend there wasn't a complicated feeling alongside all of that understanding, because there was. I am 85 years old, and I can tell you that the heart can hold more than one thing at a time. It can hold understanding and also something like grief. Not grief for what was lost, my marriage wasn't lost, but grief for not knowing, for all those decades of not knowing that the ring on my finger had carried a story before it reached me, that there was a Margaret, that she was 24, that she had loved my husband and called him Robert, and then left him in the way that's not a choice. I found her in those letters, just a handful of them, from the year they were engaged. Her handwriting was small and neat, and she had a way of expressing herself that was warm without being excessive. You could tell reading them that she was a careful person, thoughtful, the kind of person who means what she says. I sat on the floor of Harold's study and I read those letters and I cried, which surprised me. I hadn't expected to cry over letters from a woman I'd never met, a woman who had died before I even knew my husband existed, but I did. I think I was crying for Harold, mostly, for the young man he'd been, for the particular loneliness of loving someone and losing them when you're barely formed as an adult, when you're still figuring out who you are. He'd carried that so quietly for so long. Here is something I've thought about many times since. Harold and I, we had arguments over the years, not terrible ones, we weren't a dramatic couple, but real ones, about money when money was tight, about the children and how to raise them, about small things occasionally that were never really about the small things, the way marriages go. And I think about those moments now, those moments of friction, and I wonder how much of Harold's particular way of holding things, his tendency to go quiet rather than speak, to wait rather than push, to let things settle rather than force resolution, I wonder how much of that came from having lost something he loved before he could learn that love is survivable, that love can sustain itself through difficulty if you let it. He treated our marriage carefully. That's the word I keep coming back to. He was careful with it. And I used to think that was simply his nature, which it was partly. But now I think it was also something he learned, something Margaret's death had taught him in the terrible and permanent way that loss teaches. You learn something about love after many years. People don't come into a marriage empty. They come carrying their whole history, every person they've loved, every wound they've taken, every lesson that cost them something to learn. You marry a person and you think you're getting a clear beginning, a fresh page, and in a sense you are. But the person standing across from you at that altar is made of everything that happened before they got there. Harold was made partly of Margaret, of losing her.
And I spent 40 years married to that man, loving him, being occasionally frustrated by him, building an entire world with him without knowing that piece of him. And here's the strange thing. I don't think I would have done anything differently if I'd known from the beginning. I might have held him a little differently in some moments, been a little more patient perhaps with his particular way of going quiet, but I don't think the life would have been different in its essential shape. What would have been different is this: I would have known. And knowing things, even painful or complicated things, has a value that's separate from what you do with the knowing. I wish he had told me. I want to say that plainly. Not because it would have changed what we built together, but because I think it would have been a kindness to himself to say it out loud to someone who loved him, to let me know that part of him existed, to not have to carry it entirely alone for all those years. I did something after I'd sat with all of this for a few weeks. I took the ring back to Thomas Hennessy. I told him what I'd found out, as much as I knew of it. He listened respectfully, and I asked him if he could make the engraving more visible. It had worn over 40 years to the point where you really needed the light to catch it right. I asked him to make it just a little clearer. He looked at me with the kind of look that doesn't quite know what to say, and I said, "She was real. She deserves to be legible." He did it. He cleaned up the letters so they were a little more readable, not dramatic, just clearer. For M, always, ... R. I wore the ring home, and I've worn it every day since. Patricia asked me once after I told her all of this whether I thought of the ring differently now. I had to think about that. I told her that I thought of it as bigger than I used to. That's the closest I could come to the right words. I used to think of it as the ring Harold gave me, the object of our promise to each other, the physical marker of our beginning. And it is still that. It is completely still that. But it's also the ring that traveled through a grief I never witnessed, that sat in a small wooden box in the back of a desk drawer for 6 years, waiting, that was carried into a pharmacy on a Wednesday in April by a man who had decided quietly to try again. It's not smaller for having all of that in it, it's larger. I hold it sometimes, I'm not gonna lie to you. I take it off and I hold it in my palm and I think about Margaret. I think about her being 24, which seems so impossibly young to me now. I think about Harold in those years between her death and meeting me and what that solitude must have felt like. I think about the decision he made giving me this ring, whether it was a way of carrying her forward into a life she didn't get to have, whether on some level he thought she would have approved of me, which is a funny thing to wonder about someone you've never met. I think I would have liked her. That's my honest feeling reading those letters. She seems like someone I would have liked. Harold, if you're somewhere listening to this, and I don't know what I believe about that, whether the somewhere exists, I want you to know that I'm not angry. I haven't been angry, not really, not after the first few days when I was still orienting myself. I understand why you kept it quiet. I don't entirely agree with the choice, but I understand it. You were protecting something, the way you always protected things, carefully without making a fuss about it. You were a good husband, a careful one, and I know now that some of that carefulness was grief made useful, which is one of the better things a person can do with grief. I've had a good life. Our life was a good one. I just wish I'd known her name. I'm going to tell you something that I've only told Patricia, and I'll tell you because that's the point of sitting here and sharing these things.
A few months after I found out about all of this, I went to the town where Harold grew up, that small town 20 miles east of mine that I'd only visited a handful of times over the years. It's even smaller now than it was. A lot of those small Ohio towns are. I went to the cemetery. I didn't have to look very long. The Hennessy records had the family name. I'd asked Thomas about it when I went back to have the engraving touched up, and he'd been willing to share it since it was decades past and no one was left to be hurt by it. It was a last name I won't share here because it's not mine to share, but I found the stone. Margaret, 1928 to 1952, beloved daughter. Simple stone, well tended. Someone had planted something small in front of it. I don't know who, maybe a remaining relative, maybe someone who just tended the older graves because they felt it was right. I stood there for a while. It was cold. It was November by then, and the ground was hard, and the sky was flat and gray, the way Ohio skies get in November. I didn't have anything prepared to say. I'm not a woman who rehearses those kinds of moments. I just stood there and I thought about her. About the life that fit between 1928 and 1952, which is 24 years, which is not very long at all. And then I said out loud to the gray sky and the cold ground, and whoever or whatever might be in a position to hear it, he was happy. I want you to know that. He had a good life and he was happy in it, and I took good care of him. I meant it as a kindness, not as a competition, not as a claim, just as information that I thought she might want to have, if information can travel in that direction. I don't know if it does, but it seemed worth saying. I've been turning this ring around on my finger while I've been talking to you, which is a habit I've had for decades without knowing why. I know now. It's just become the thing my hand does when I'm thinking. The diamond is a little cloudy now with age, mine and its own. The band has scratches I couldn't name the sources of. The prongs that hold the stone were replaced once, sometime in the 1980s, when young Clarence, old Clarence by then, noticed they were wearing thin. The band itself has been sized twice. It's not the same object it was in 1952 when someone whose initial was R stood at a counter in Hennessy's Jewelers and asked for an engraving. It's not the same object it was in 1961 when Harold put it on my finger in a cold car with the heater ticking. But it's the same ring. Continuity works like that. Things change and remain themselves simultaneously, which is true of rings and true of people and true, I think, of love. I used to think that ring only told the story of our marriage. But now I understand. It carried a story long before it ever reached my hand. It carried a young man's particular grief and a young woman's short life and 6 years of a small wooden box in the back of a desk drawer for a Wednesday in April with a forsythia blooming and a decision to try again. All of that was already in the ring when he put it on my finger. I just didn't know it yet. And somehow, and this is the thing I couldn't have predicted sitting at that kitchen table in October with the autumn light coming through the window, somehow, knowing all of it now makes it mean more, not less, more. because love is not diminished by the fact that it existed before you arrived. A person's capacity to love is not reduced by the people they loved before you. If anything, you're the beneficiary of it. All that practice, all that tenderness that had nowhere to go, all that understanding of what loss costs and how precious the ordinary days are, and how worth protecting the small good thing in your hands really is. Harold loved me carefully. Now I know where he learned to be careful. I'm going to close now. My coffee is cold, and the light in this room is doing something lovely in the late afternoon, and I find that I want to just sit quietly with that for a while, with the ring on my finger, and the light in the room, and the whole long life behind me that I'm still at 85 finding new things inside of. That's the real gift of a long life, if you want to know. Not the wisdom everyone assumes you have, not the peace. Just this: there's still so much to find, so much that reveals itself when the light hits it at the right angle on an ordinary afternoon. Take care of each other. And if you're married, or if you love someone in any form that love takes, be a little curious about their history. Not suspicious, curious. Ask the questions while you can, because the stories people carry are worth knowing, even the ones they hold quietly, maybe especially those. Good evening, Elizabeth May.